Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining. I'm Cynthia Benz, and I serve as Vice President of Public Policy at the Alliance for Aging Research and Executive Director of the Accelerate Cures and Treatments for Alzheimer's Disease, or ACT-AD Coalition. I'll be the moderator for today's program. On behalf of ACT-AD, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our third in a series of webinars focused on issues that are critical to the future of Alzheimer's disease research and therapeutic development. Today, more than 5 million Americans live with Alzheimer's disease. Because we do not yet know how to prevent Alzheimer's, as the population ages, the number of people with this disease is expected to reach 13.8 million by the middle of the century. Nearly 500,000 seniors are expected to develop it in 2017, and just last week, the Alzheimer's Association placed the cost of caring for AD at $259 billion this year alone. The cost will rise to $1.1 trillion by 2050 in the absence of new medical breakthroughs. ACT-AD is a coalition of more than 50 national nonprofit organizations working with urgency to speed up the development of potential cures and more effective treatments for Alzheimer's disease. We do this by urging FDA officials and other policymakers to increase the attention and resources they devote to the challenges posed by AD. Until the formation of ACT-AD in 2005, there was no single point of advocacy in the regulatory space around the need for better treatments to combat Alzheimer's disease that combine the perspectives of respected advocates for research, women's health, aging services, and caregivers. We're strengthened by the diversity of the organizations that make up the coalition and are bringing that strength to bear on critical issues before the federal government concerning the development, review, and approval of a new generation of Alzheimer's disease treatments. One action the FDA took in 2006 in response to ACT-AD's advocacy was to begin working with the coalition on an annual meeting where representatives from the FDA could interact with leaders in the patient advocacy community, academia, and industry on issues that are current roadblocks or potential roadblocks to the successful review of new Alzheimer's disease products. ACT-ADs convened 9 of these high-impact meetings on topics ranging from measuring clinical meaningfulness in AD, improving the efficiency of Phase 2 trials, pursuing combination therapy development for Alzheimer's disease, and assessing the scientific foundation for AD drug development. Many of our discussions and other scientific meetings have emphasized strides that would support drugs to delay or prevent the onset of Alzheimer's disease. Less attention's been paid to advancing treatments for the overt symptoms of Alzheimer's disease that many people have already begun experiencing by the time they're diagnosed. For these individuals, a cure may not be effective and will need better symptomatic treatments to help them. Alzheimer's is a progressive disease that involves parts of the brain that control thought, memory, and language. Its progression varies from person to person. Some people can live as few as 4 years, and others can live almost 20 years, depending on the rate their symptoms progress. Alzheimer's disease often begins with mild memory loss, leading to challenges with conversation. It eventually causes an inability to respond to the environment around us. People require increasing levels of care as the disease progresses because damage to their nerve cells seriously affects the ability to perform even the most routine tasks. As more care is required, family caregivers often suffer from a decline in their own health while attending to the needs of a spouse, parent, or other loved one with AD. During today's webinar, Symptomatic Relief for Alzheimer's Disease, 3 stellar experts will share their perspectives on the burden of Alzheimer's disease symptoms and areas of unmet need, highlight advances in neurobiology that relate to Alzheimer's disease symptoms, and they'll update you on recent clinical development activities to try to improve the treatment of Alzheimer's symptoms. I'd like to say how grateful we are to have the support for ACT-AD from Avonex, Avanir, Axovant, Biogen, Eli Lilly, Genentech, Janssen, Lundbeck, Merck, Novartis, and Otsuka. Without your generosity, programs like the one today would not be possible, so thank you so very much. I'd also like to thank my colleagues Sarah DeGiovane, Ryan Carney, Noel Lloyd, and Brianna Bishop for their assistance with this webinar. And last, I just need to take care of a few housekeeping items. There are over 100 registrants on the webinar, so all participant lines have been automatically muted. You can submit a question at any point throughout the webinar using the chat function or by emailing me at cbenz@agingresearch.org. Each presenter will speak approximately 15 minutes, and will not be taking questions at the end of each presentation. We're going to hold them until the end of the program, where we'll have a 10 to 15-minute Q&A period. We'll answer as many questions as we can at the close of the program by 1 p.m. But if your questions are not addressed, please email me, and I'll work to get your questions answered by email. We're recording today's program. The recording and presentation slides will be available 1 week after the webinar on our website, www.act-ad.org. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker, Dr. Jeff Cummings. Dr. Cummings is director of the Cleveland Clinic Lou Ruvo Brain Center for Health. He is the Camille and Larry Ruvo Chair for Brain Health. Dr. Cummings' research and leadership in the field of Alzheimer's disease have been recognized with many awards, including the Henderson Award of the American Geriatric Society, the Research Award of the John Douglas French Alzheimer's Research Foundation, and the Ronald and Nancy Reagan Research Award of the National Alzheimer's Association. In 2010, he was honored by the American Association of Geriatric Psychiatry with their Distinguished Scientist Award. Dr. Cummings is the author of the Neuropsychiatric Inventory, the NPI, which is the most commonly used tool for characterizing behavioral disturbances and dementia syndromes and for measuring the effect of therapies on neuropsychiatric symptoms in Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. He's an experienced clinical trialist with expertise in clinical trial design and analysis, global trial implementation, and trial outcome measures. Dr. Cummings has published over 600 articles and 35 books on Alzheimer's disease and related topics. We're fortunate to have him join us today to talk about how the neuropsychiatric and behavioral manifestations of Alzheimer's disease are being addressed and the existing areas of unmet need. So Dr. Cummings, please take it away.
Thank you, Cynthia, and thank you for all your work and leadership on ACT-AD. It really is a great coalition. It has been the only channel for discussions with the FDA around evolving topics, and I just think it's been such important work that I really appreciate your efforts and leadership in ACT-AD. So today I'm going to talk about neuropsychiatric and behavioral manifestations of Alzheimer's disease. Cynthia emphasized the importance of symptomatic relief of the disease, and of course I think broadly speaking that might include cognitive enhancers on one side and relief of neuropsychiatric symptoms on the other. So today we'll be talking about the neuropsychiatric and behavioral manifestations of Alzheimer's disease. Next slide. Here are my disclosures. I have worked with many companies in an effort to find best possible treatments for Alzheimer's disease. Next slide. I thought I would begin by contrasting disease-modifying versus symptomatic treatments. There's a lot of emphasis now on disease-modifying treatments, and of course they're very, very important. We figure out how to delay the onset or slow the progression of Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative disorders, but we also have to have symptomatic relief. I thought it'd be worth contrasting these two ways of thinking about Alzheimer's disease. Talk a little bit about neuropsychiatric symptoms and how they represent a great unmet need in Alzheimer's disease. I have a feeling that all of our listeners know that. That's why they're listening. I'll talk a little bit about the clinical and biological features of neuropsychiatric symptoms and emerging therapies and trials before I turn it over to my colleagues. Next slide. So let's think a little bit about symptomatic versus disease-modifying therapies in Alzheimer's disease. Symptomatic, by definition, means that it does not impact the underlying cell death that leads to the progression of Alzheimer's disease, whereas disease-modifying therapies impact the processes that lead to cell death and thereby delay the onset or prevent the onset under optimal circumstances or slow the progression. Symptomatic therapies do not produce an enduring change in the disease course, although they do importantly change the disease course in terms of the symptomatic manifestations, whereas disease-modifying therapies are aimed to produce enduring changes in the disease course. That's why we use designs such as the delayed start or the randomized withdrawal design to show that enduring change has been produced. Symptomatic therapies address pressing current symptoms, whereas disease-modifying therapies address future decline in cognition. The idea of disease-modifying therapy, of course, is to prevent the emergence of new symptoms, but not to address currently present symptoms. Symptomatic trials are shorter and smaller, typically 3 to 6 months in duration, typically a few hundred patients per arm. Disease-modifying therapies tend to run 18 to 24 months in terms of trials and to have in excess of 1,000 patients per trial. Symptomatic therapies can now usually be addressed with a single outcome, such as is depression reduced or is agitation reduced. Disease-modifying therapies require dual outcomes. Even when a composite measure is used, it's important to show that both a cognitive and functional benefit has been obtained. Symptomatic therapies have less emphasis on biomarkers, although they may use occupancy studies, for example, in the case of receptor antagonist or agonist, whereas disease-modifying therapies use biomarkers such as CSF beta and tau, amyloid imaging, tau imaging, or MRI. Symptomatic therapies have a well-understood regulatory pathway. We have 4 cholinesterase inhibitors that have been approved and 1 NMDA receptor antagonist that has been approved. We understand how the federal regulatory agencies view this development pathway. On the other hand, the regulatory pathway for disease-modifying therapy has not yet been fully explored because there are no approved drugs that are disease-modifying. Next slide. Neuropsychiatric symptoms are present in nearly all Alzheimer's disease patients. 90% of patients will exhibit some degree of neuropsychiatric symptomatology. They increase in frequency, severity, and multiplicity over time. So they begin infrequently with low severity. As the disease progresses through mild, moderate, and severe disease, they become more frequent, more severe, and more symptoms appear. There are multiple simultaneous symptoms, so it's common for a patient to be depressed, irritable, and anxious, or to have hallucinations, delusions, agitation, and irritability. So these are complex clusters of symptoms that emerge in Alzheimer's disease patients. They're highly recurrent after onset. In one study that we did, for example, we showed that a symptom that appears is likely, it has an 80% likelihood of being present at the time of the next examination. So although there is some fluctuation from visit to visit, they are highly recurrent once they begin, and continuous treatment is likely necessary. It's also been observed that there is faster cognitive decline in the presence of neuropsychiatric symptoms, both agitation and psychosis. So there is an interaction between the cognitive manifestations of Alzheimer's disease and the neuropsychiatric symptoms. Next slide. There's a negative impact on the patient's quality of life and a negative impact on caregiver quality of life. Both of these have been measured with quality of life measures. The neuropsychiatric symptoms correlate with impaired functional ability. This may be both a functional interaction such that the patient who is agitated cannot at the same time carry on a more normal lifestyle, and they may be mediated by similar neurobiology. So a patient with greater frontal lobe involvement will have greater functional disability and more neuropsychiatric symptoms. Neuropsychiatric symptoms are a frequent cause of residential care. Next to incontinence, they are one of the great causes of the decision to provide a patient in care in a residential setting. And of course, they greatly increase the cost of care since the care is often delivered in a community. Next slide. Some common observations that unite neuropsychiatric symptoms. There are more neuropsychiatric symptoms with more advanced brain disease, so we do see this increasing over the course of the disease. There are higher frontal tau levels in patients with agitation and psychosis. So this has been a very interesting observation. Tau tends to reside in the limbic system of the brain and tends to be associated, not surprisingly, with more neuropsychiatric symptoms. There are higher CSF tau levels in Alzheimer's disease patients with agitation, another link to tau. And monoamine dysfunction appears to contribute importantly to neuropsychiatric symptoms such as irritability, euphoria, hyperactivity, and depression. Next slide. I thought I would note the realms of the neuropsychiatric symptoms currently of interest in terms of drug development. We know that there are no approved agents for neuropsychiatric symptoms in AD except for PBA, which we'll be discussing in more detail today. There are no approved treatments for agitation, none for psychosis, none for depression, none for apathy, and none for sleep disturbances. All of these are unmet needs, and all of these have current clinical trials associated with them. It is of interest that PD psychosis does now have an FDA-approved antipsychotic medication, pimavanserin. I think that represents an important and new approach to neuropsychiatric symptoms in neurodegenerative disease. And dextromethorphan quinidine, or Nuedexta, has been approved for PBA across neurological conditions, so including dementia, but also including vascular disease, multiple sclerosis, traumatic brain injury, and we'll be hearing much more about this in the next two lectures. Next slide. Agitation is one of the areas where there is substantial new activity in terms of trying to develop new therapies. This is one of the great unmet needs. The new definition of agitation in cognitive impairment by the IPA has allowed us to identify populations that can be entered into clinical trials, and so there's a great deal of activity in this area. The most commonly used agents right now are risperidone and quetiapine, both atypical antipsychotics. An agent which is being tested in a phase 3 trial at this point for agitation in Alzheimer's disease is brexpiprazole. Dextromethorphan quinidine has been tested and had a positive trial for agitation in Alzheimer's disease. SSRIs, the citalopram in Alzheimer's disease trial showed that citalopram can reduce agitation, although at the expense of a mini-mental state examination decline and a QTC prolongation. Escitalopram is currently being tested in an agitation trial. Pimavanserin is being interrogated in terms of its possible application in agitation in Alzheimer's disease. As I mentioned, it has been approved for psychosis in Parkinson's disease. And prazosin, an alpha-adrenergic blocker, is being studied by the Alzheimer's Disease Cooperative Study as a possible treatment for agitation in Alzheimer's disease. Next slide. This is also an area where there are new directions. I'm excited about this because it shows that we're thinking about the neurobiology of Alzheimer's disease in new and creative ways. So among the agents that are being investigated in agitation with novel mechanisms are ORM 12741. This is a mixed transmitter mechanism, ITI 007. Also is a 5-HT2A antagonist, but has other transmitter effects as well. Dextromethorphan plus Wellbutrin is being investigated. The role of cannabinoids is being investigated. ELND 005, the psiloinositol, is being looked at for patients with severe agitation. And orexin agents, the DORAs, or dual orexin antagonists, are being looked at for nocturnal agitation. Next slide. So agents that are currently in phase 2 or phase 4 for clinical trials for agitation include brexpiprazole, aripiprazole, dextromethorphan and quinidine, the cannabinoid nabilone, mirtazapine, and a carbamazepine comparison, ITI 007, and escitalopram. These are all in phase 3 trials. There's a phase 3 methylphenidate trial for apathy. There's a phase 3 suvorexant trial for sleep, a phase 4 DMQ trial for PBA, and currently no phase 3 trials for depression or psychosis, although drugs are being looked at in phase 2 for both of those indications. Next slide. So to summarize the points that I think are worth emphasizing in this introduction to a consideration of symptomatic relief for Alzheimer's disease, There are multiple neuropsychiatric symptoms in Alzheimer's disease, and they are very common in the disorder, in excess of 90% of patients exhibiting neuropsychiatric symptoms in the course of their disease. The neuropsychiatric symptoms worsen as the disease course progresses from mild, moderate, and severe Alzheimer's dementias. They also begin in the MCI, or prodromal phase of Alzheimer's disease. Neuropsychiatric symptoms exaggerate patient and caregiver burden and compromise quality of life. Symptomatic agents are needed and will complement the disease-modifying therapies that are also under study. Emerging agents have diversified mechanisms. I'm excited about this, and I showed you some of the novel transmitter mechanisms that are currently being investigated. And emerging agents in phase 3 and 4 address agitation, apathy, sleep, and pseudobulbar affect. Cynthia, I'll turn it back over to you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Dr. Cummings, for that really excellent presentation and overview. We have had a few questions come in already, so it's definitely going to be a lively Q&A. Next, I have the pleasure of introducing our second speaker, Dr. Richard Malamud. Dr. Malamud is currently Senior Vice President of Research and Development and the Chief Medical Officer at Avenir Pharmaceuticals. He's responsible for the strategic and operational leadership of clinical development, non-clinical development, pharmacovigilance, research and development operations, biostatistics, regulatory affairs, quality affairs, pharmaceutical development and supply chain, and medical affairs. Prior to Avenir, he was the Senior Vice President of Global Clinical Development at Teva Pharmaceuticals, where he was responsible for directing all aspects within clinical development for the company's neuropsychiatric, pain, oncology, and new therapeutic entity products. In that role, he led global cross-functional teams focused on clinical development of both early development and late development compounds in analgesia, neurology, and psychiatry. Prior to that, he had roles of increasing responsibility at Bristol Myers Squibb and AstraZeneca, as well as consulting for Schwartz Bioscience and Shire Pharmaceuticals. Dr. Malamud earned his medical degree from Hahnemann University in Philadelphia and was a board-certified academic clinical neurologist for more than 20 years. He has more than 50 publications in the field of neuromuscular disease, autonomic disease, and pain medicine. And he's going to speak to us about an affective disorder that can occur with Alzheimer's disease and the impact it has on patients. So let me pull up your slides.
Yeah, well, thank you, Cynthia. And let me just echo Dr. Cummings' comment to thank you and your group for really doing a great job in really getting disease awareness, and specifically not forgetting the symptomatic treatments. You know, we all agree that disease modification is important. We're going to keep working on that. But while we're working on that, we do need to be mindful that the patients are still having symptoms that need treatment, and we do have some treatments for those. So I'm going to be spending a little time speaking to all of you about one of those associated symptoms with dementia and other neurologic diseases, pseudobulbar affect. So if we go to the next slide. So pseudobulbar affect is a disorder of emotional expression, and it's characterized by a sudden onset, very quick, very frequent, and important for the patient, uncontrollable outbursts of laughing or crying that are not related to the mood. They're crying, but they're not sad. They're laughing, but they haven't just heard a joke. So that's important to recognize. And it can occur due to not just dementia, but many different neurologic conditions, such as ALS, multiple sclerosis, stroke, traumatic brain injury, and I'll be talking about some of those, as well as the prevalence in Alzheimer's disease and other dementias. So if we go to the next slide. And it's important to recognize that it's not just a symptom for physicians to treat. It actually has quite a lot of impact for the patients and quite a lot of impact for the caregivers. It can be quite disruptive, and for the patient who's aware of it but can't control it, quite embarrassing. And so these patients don't wish to go out in public. And for the caregiver who may take their patient, their loved one, their family, their friend out in public, it impacts them as well. They don't necessarily want to be out with the patient who has this. And we know that it can not only impair function in activities of daily living, but also quality of life. So we know that the prevalence is undetermined. It's estimated to be about 2 million people in the U.S. alone. We believe it's quite under-recognized, however, and very much under-treated. And based on some data I'll show you, it's estimated that over 29% of patients with dementia have pseudobulbar affect symptoms, so quite a large number of patients. If we go to the next slide. So as a neurologist, it's impossible for me to give a presentation without mentioning neuroanatomy. So I am going to, just to show you a brain, because I have to, it's in the neurology union that I must. So here's a brain, and here's some of the connections. Did it change on the slide? Okay, it just didn't change here. So again, here are some of the connections in schematic fashion in this cartoon, showing descending and ascending pathways up from the brainstem and through the pons in the middle, as well as connections into the cerebellum. And all of these are involved to not only do the important functions of motor and sensory and balance, but also coordinate emotional expression. Now, in some of the diseases, next slide, that I'll be highlighting, there's disruption somewhere within the cerebropontocerebellar circuitry, and it prevents the appropriate transmission of information that dampens emotional outbursts, so that you don't get the appropriate depression of laughing and crying, allowing it to manifest. And so the diseases that we know are associated with pseudobulbar affect also impair these pathways in global fashion. It's not a single lesion in the brain, like a single stroke, that will do it. You need more widespread and impairment on both sides of the brain. And certainly diseases such as Alzheimer's disease have widespread impact on these pathways. So if we could go to the next slide, how is pseudobulbar affect diagnosed? So like many diseases in the psychiatric and neurologic world, it's a clinical diagnosis based on a good history, as well as a neuropsychiatric assessment. And while pseudobulbar affect is not in the DSM-5, there have been some clinical criteria that have been established, both by Professor Polk way back in 1969 and updated by one of our other speakers, Dr. Cummings, in 2013. And as you can see here, that it's laughing and or crying, it's continuous and inappropriate. The situation is not appropriate. The patient's feelings are not tied to the actual responses I mentioned. They're not sad when they cry. They're not happy when they're laughing. And the duration and severity can't be controlled by the patient, and expression of the emotion doesn't lead to a feeling of relief. So Dr. Cummings expanded on these and made a little clearer definition of what pseudobulbar affect is. And you can see those on the right side of the slide, in which not only is it an involuntary and exaggerated emotional expression, it results from a brain disorder, and here including laughing and crying. It has to be a change. It'll come out of nowhere, where a patient can be interacting in a, quote, normal fashion, and then suddenly burst out into uncontrollable laughing or crying, and again, disproportionate to mood. And as I've highlighted before, and this is incredibly important, it causes significant distress or social occupational impairment. That's what we're trying to address here. And it can't be accounted for by a coexisting psychiatric or neurologic disorder, and it can't be due to a drug. Next slide. So we do have some scales that are available to us. We use these in our clinical studies of pseudobulbar affect. They're also available for use in controlled settings, in long-term care facilities. The Center for Neurologic Lability Scale, the CNSLS, which is the scale that we used in our clinical studies, is a self-administered, a patient-reported outcome measure in which there are 4 items related to laughter, 3 related to crying. When you score greater than or equal to 13, it likely suggests the presence of pseudobulbar affect, and as you get more severe, greater than 21, it can be quite severe and quite debilitating. And then the pathologic laughing and crying scale, as you see on the screen, and then even a simple screening question. Just asking the patient if they've ever had involuntary episodes of crying and or laughing that were exaggerated or contrary to how they felt at the time should lead clinicians to do a deeper exploration of the symptoms and whether the patient may be appropriate for some sort of therapy. If we go to the next slide, this is a registry that we conducted at Avenir, the PRISM registry, in which using that CNS-LS scale, we assessed 5,290 outpatients, so quite a large number of outpatients, with various neurologic conditions. If you go to the next slide, it's not showing up. There it is. And as you can see, and I put a circle around Alzheimer's disease, but we looked at many different neurologic conditions. As you can see, ALS, multiple sclerosis, traumatic brain injury had the highest incidence, but Alzheimer's disease, 29% of those patients had symptoms of pseudobulbar affect. And it isn't simply Alzheimer's disease. We've seen it in other dementias, vascular dementia, frontotemporal dementia, and other less frequent dementias also will have symptoms of pseudobulbar affect. So that's all I was going to say today. Perhaps during our Q&A we can generate some additional discussion, but hopefully that gives everyone a good understanding of what pseudobulbar affect is all about.
And thank you very much, Dr. Malamud, for that amazing overview of this condition. I can imagine that this is something that's incredibly frustrating for both people with the disease as well as their families. So, so we look forward to having some questions on that as well. So now I have the pleasure of introducing our last speaker, who is going to take a less conventional approach to to giving her presentation. She's not going to be using slides. Dr. Joan Amatniak is a physician researcher who's worked for large companies that make medicines for over 15 years. She's most interested in the phase of drug development where the drugs are tested in people who have illnesses, which is the last step in a many-year process. She currently works for Otsuka Pharmaceutical Development and Commercialization as a Senior Director in Clinical Development. As a neurologist and epidemiologist in the pharmaceutical industry, she's committed to improving the lives of people who suffer from diseases of the brain, particularly chronic progressive disorders such as Alzheimer's disease. And her focus comes from almost a decade as a caregiver to her father who had Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Amatniak earned a Bachelor's of Arts in History and Science from Harvard University. She worked as a reporter in Washington, D.C., and attended school at Columbia University for journalism. Later, she attended medical school at Albert Einstein College of Medicine at Yeshiva University in the Bronx, where she received training in neurology at the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania in neurology and epidemiology at what was then called Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in Upper Manhattan. And so, Joan, I'm going to be taking your line off of mute, and you can start your remarks whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Cynthia, for the opportunity to speak today. I echo the sentiments of the other speakers and that I appreciate the advocacy work that you do and that your member organizations do on behalf of Alzheimer's disease patients and their families. As Cynthia mentioned, I work at Otsuka, and there I lead the clinical development for our compounds that will hopefully in the future be approved for the treatment of symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. Please note, what I'm going to share with you today are my opinions and do not reflect the views of the company or any of its affiliates. When my daughter was 4 years old, she was asked at preschool about her parents' work. She said, "My mommy leaves me every day to find a way to help my grandfather remember my name." So this journey for me hasn't just been professional, it's also very personal. And the personal has influenced me every step of the way in my professional decision making. The symptoms of dementia were the backdrop of my family's life for 18 years. and even impacted our vital statistics. You see, my father had Alzheimer's, like Cynthia mentioned, and my mother was his caregiver for 9 years until she died of an unexpected caregiver's heart attack. We didn't even have the words then, caregiver's heart attack. After her death, my sister and I picked up the pieces for the next 9 years. I will never forget one day getting this call from my sister. She started with, "Dad isn't in the apartment. I can't find him anywhere. I woke up to find him missing." This was so scary to me because I knew the numbers. The only reason he was found is because of our last name, Amatnik, starting with an A. After finding an ID in my dad's pocket, the Jacoby ER in the Bronx looked through all the borough directories of New York City and called the only Amatnik. And luckily, we were there to pick up the phone. You've just heard my dad's worst wandering story. Wandering is one of the ways behavioral difficulties can present in Alzheimer's disease. Usually, though, in professional circles, I tend to hear more about people talking about agitation as a predictor, let's say, of nursing home placement, as Dr. Cummings so eloquently discussed. But there are many other behavioral difficulties, as Dr. Cummings mentioned too, for patients that have big impacts on their families. The example of wandering is such as the example of wandering, which I just shared. When these phone calls happened, I was a fellow at the Neurologic Institute at Columbia Presbyterian, and early in my career, the helplessness of caregiving was what pushed me to join the pharmaceutical industry. I hadn't even ever thought about this before, so this was really different for me and from people's expectations for me. My first job was working on one of the acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, those drugs that went into the marketplace at the end of the last century for the treatment of the cognitive symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, and that's the symptomatic treatment. An early learning for me after I joined the pharmaceutical industry, when I was learning how to work as a leader of teams, is that difficult problems could often be resolved by asking these simple questions to the team. How does what we're talking about affect the patient? How does it affect the caregiver? These two simple questions seem to cut across the various interests of the scientists, the development people, the medical people, the commercial people, the payer people, and the people who had regulatory concerns. And the patients and the caregiver very successfully, when we talked about them, brought together the cross-functional teams into consensus decision-making. It was really great. Unbeknownst to us then, these were the easy years of Alzheimer's drug development. These were the years that the trials were positive and led to approvals. We thought symptomatic treatment for what was then called mild cognitive impairment was just around the corner, and the disease modifiers would be a snap. Well, maybe not a snap, but with enough ingenuity and elbow grease, they would happen maybe in the next decade or so. You all know what happened next, in what I will euphemistically call the learning years, when one trial after another was negative. During this time, I continued to work on the same symptomatic compound and then switched companies to work on a potential disease modifier tied to the amyloid hypothesis. As is often the case, the phase 2 findings of this compound did not warrant a phase 3 program. And phase 3 have had an even lower success rate than phase 2. In fact, since the early 2000s, none of the phase 3 trials for a new compound has been positive. It's hard to estimate the costs and human resources that have been deployed in this difficult but worthwhile effort. But just as an example, around 2010, the cost of a phase 3 disease-modifying program consisting of 2 trials was said to approximately be around $1 billion, and this was just the phase 3 program for that compound. So in this context, I needed to figure out what next. I was a bit burnt out on Alzheimer's, and my commitment was wavering a little bit. And other former caregivers told me, though, it was okay to step away. I listened to them. But in about 3 years, I returned back to my passion of trying to find ways to get treatment for people with Alzheimer's disease. Here, I decided then to join Otsuka because the company was investigating symptomatic agents. The response of most of my research friends was, really? Symptomatic agents? Implying, why would I want to do that, not a disease modifier? Well, here comes that personal stuff again. Because of my family's experience, I was interested in working on products that might help people who are already suffering from memory loss and behavioral issues. And well, I must admit that I also hope to work on something that seemed, in my opinion, to have a better chance of phase 3 success. Right now, my focus is on a compound in phase 3 being investigated for one of the behavioral issues associated with Alzheimer's disease. There are currently no approved compounds in this space. We'll see what happens here, and of course, fingers crossed, all of us, but you've seen my truth, or I guess heard it, which is that my caregiving experience informs my professional decision-making every day and keeps me plugging away at what's the often frustrating field of Alzheimer's disease drug development. Thank you all very much. And Cynthia, back to you now.
Great. Thanks so much, Joan. And we're going to leave your line unmuted because we've actually had a few questions come in that you might want to jump in on at some point. So just be aware your line's off of mute, and Jeff, yours is as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. So our first question, it says that there's going to be the first ever Care Research Summit at the National Institutes of Health this fall. Do any of you have any suggestions for what the summit organizers should be thinking regarding how they should include symptomatic therapies into the care research discussions that they're going to have over 2 days? Jeff, do you have any thoughts on that?
I can plunge in, and then I'm sure other people will have ideas as well. The disease-modifying therapies are increasingly aimed at the preclinical state where patients do not have symptoms. That's followed then by the prodromal state where minimal symptoms are present, and there is least work on most disease-modifying therapies in the dementia phase of the illness. This is exactly in contrast to when patients most need care. That is, preclinical patients are asymptomatic, they need no care whatsoever. Prodromal patients are beginning to be symptomatic and they need a minimum of care. Patients with dementia need a lot of care and they progressively become dependent on their caregivers. So a care summit is by definition going to involve patients in later phase of the disease. This is exactly when neuropsychiatric symptoms as well as cognitive symptoms are at their worst. 30% of the current AD drug development pipeline is aimed at symptomatic therapies, and it should definitely be a part of the Care Research Summit, both from the point of view of accelerating the research as well as emphasizing both the neuropsychiatric and the cognitive symptoms of the care portion of the illness.
No, I think that's very well said. I think it's really focusing a bit more on, not that it's been forgotten, but as we're developing our disease-modifying agents, which may take a little longer, we can't forget the patients and the caregivers who are having symptoms now. And we need to be able to try to focus on treating them now while we're waiting. And I agree with you, Jeff. I think a summit such as this could be quite useful in steering caregivers and the patients towards effective therapies now and in development.
Joan, do you have anything you'd like to add on the summit?
Yeah, and I think another thing that would be really interesting to include is we sometimes talk about the echo effect, potentially, of therapies from the patient to the caregiver. Caregivers with Alzheimer's disease have higher mortality and morbidity rates than age-matched controls. So one of the things to talk about is how do we incorporate the caregiver while we're thinking about the patient, and are there ways to do that which are ethical both for the patient and for the caregiver?
Those are all terrific suggestions, and I believe we did have a few people who are involved in organizing the summit who are going to be joining the webinar, so hopefully they'll hear your messages loud and clear. The second question we had come in, Rick might be the most appropriate person to answer it. It's how can it be that PBA is not in the DSM-5, but the disorder has been approved for drug treatment?
Yeah. So in the psychiatry world, we think that it must be in the DSM-5. I think it elucidates the point, amplifies the point that PBA is not just a psychiatric disorder, and is treated not only by psychiatrists but also neurologists, geriatricians, internal medicine, and so on. So presence or absence in the DSM-5 shouldn't impact its approvability. It does have an indication.
The next question is that it seems that phase 3 studies for AD agitation are with a deuterated version of DMQ. As a physician, why would you use this agent versus Nuedexta and versus antipsychotics?
Yeah, so I can take a stab at that. So at Avenir, we are running phase 3 studies, as Jeff mentioned, in agitation and Alzheimer's with a deuterated dextromethorphan combined with a lower dose of quinidine. And that may be the answer to your question. The Nuedexta uses a 10 milligram dose of quinidine, which even at that low dose, which is much less than the therapeutic dose of quinidine, which is north of 600 milligrams, still there are, concerns over potential cardiac symptoms. And so by using a deuterated form of dextromethorphan, which also serves the purpose of blocking the metabolic pathway of dextromethorphan, which is 2D6, we're able to utilize a lower dose of quinidine in our formulation, which I believe has the potential to even further lower the risk of cardiac effects while still getting enough dextromethorphan to cause the desired effect in agitation.
Really interesting. Did anyone else have anything they wanted to add on that question? Jeff or Jim?
I'll take the second part of the question, which is why use the deuterated DMQ versus Nuedexta versus brexpiprazole if it were approved. Right. So I'd say, first of all, we want an approved agent. Right now, we have no approved agents for agitation. So the deuterated form of DMQ is moving along that pathway, and brexpiprazole is moving along that pathway, along with the other agents that I talked about in my introduction. We hope actually that multiple agents are approved because a physician wants to have alternatives. You want to be able to match the drug to the patient and to the patient's symptom complex, and we hope that we're going to learn much more about that so that we can individualize and personalize medicine as the repertoire of therapies increases and becomes available to us. So I think right now I couldn't say why would I choose the deuterated DMQ over brexpiprazole. I would say I want multiple alternatives available so that in the clinic I can begin making those kinds of choices.
Great. So the next question is related to Lewy body dementia. So I'm going to throw it out there, and if we can't get an answer, I promise to shoot this off to the rest of the members of the Science Advisory Board and try to get a response for you. What is the exact difference in phenotypes as well as identification of AD from Lewy body dementia, and what are the similarities? Jeff, do you have a thought on that? Sure.
Well, our dementia with Lewy bodies is one of our differential diagnostic challenges when we're treating a patient with a dementia syndrome or assessing a patient with a dementia syndrome. And we know from autopsy studies that we tend to under-recognize dementia with Lewy bodies. So it is important to try to get the criteria into people's consciousness more than it is now. The critical criteria for dementia with Lewy bodies are visual hallucinations, Parkinsonism, and fluctuating cognition. And by fluctuating cognition is meant that patients have periods where they are quite lucid, and periods where there may either be quite confused or even somnolent. And those may vary over a number of hours or over a number of days. But there is more good times and bad times in terms of cognition in the DLB patient than in the patient with Alzheimer's disease. Pathologically, then, there, of course, is a greater dopamine deficiency in DLB than there is in Alzheimer's disease. That's why they have Parkinsonism. There is involvement of the brainstem to the striatonigral pathways. There is the cognitive profile is very similar to Alzheimer's disease, but maybe with a little bit more executive dysfunction and a little bit more visual spatial dysfunction and a little less memory dysfunction. So it's similar to, overlaps with, but has a slightly different profile. Correspondingly, there's less atrophy of the hippocampal regions on MRI in DLB. Very important for this discussion is the prominence of neuropsychiatric symptoms tends to lead physicians to use the available agents, which are atypical antipsychotics, and patients with DLB, because they already have compromise of the dopaminergic pathways of the brain, have an exuberant response. This is one of the secondary characteristics of the disease. They have an exuberant negative response to the use of antipsychotic medications. So this is a place where we really need alternatives to control psychosis, hallucinations, delusions, depression, agitation. This is a disorder that has a multitude of neuropsychiatric symptoms, and it is a great unmet need in terms of treatment for these. So we do turn to other agents, non-antipsychotic, non-dopamine blocking agents, as the first line of therapy in this group of patients, and that's why it's so important to try to be able to recognize them by these symptoms of visual hallucinations, fluctuating cognition, and Parkinsonism. When you see those symptoms in a patient with a dementia syndrome, I'd be thinking DLB rather than Alzheimer's disease.
Terrific. Okay, so we touched a bit about the NIH Care Summit and the opportunity that that's going to present, but you know that most of us who are members of ACT-AD are advocates at heart and always anxious to try to do whatever we can to advocate before all the federal agencies and Congress to try to move things along more quickly. So I'll ask just an open question and anyone could jump in. In addition to the Care Summit, are there any other activities that you think the NIH, FDA, or Congress should be taking, just in your opinion, to more rapidly facilitate the development of improved symptomatic treatments for Alzheimer's, given that there is a bit of an understood already pathway for getting symptomatic treatments approved? I think there's anything more that people could be doing. Joan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Give me a second. I do, but let someone else go first, and I'll give a better response.
Okay.
This is Jeff. I'll just jump in here to say that in general, I think the FDA has been very supportive in terms of trying to develop new treatments. It's often felt that the FDA somehow represents an unusual hurdle or challenge for drug development. You know, they have affected parents. They know the society is greatly challenged by this disease. I think they want new therapies like everyone else does. Their responsibility is to protect the public health, and so they take that responsibility seriously. But I think working with the FDA in the way ACT-AD has is extremely important, and I wonder whether we shouldn't revisit the idea of neuropsychiatric symptoms with them, Cynthia, in a future seminar. But I do think that we'll find the FDA receptive. I think Congress, through legislation, can encourage pharmaceutical and biotech industries to emerge, to engage in more drug development for Alzheimer's disease. We've had a high failure rate in Alzheimer's disease, even in symptomatic agents. And there are legislative means of encouraging more industry involvement so we can get to new therapies. We know that 97% of new therapies for any disease come from the pharmaceutical industry, and we're going to need to attract them into this space, even though it's very difficult from a drug development perspective.
Absolutely.
Okay, Cynthia, so I'd like to, I agree with all that Jeff has said. One other thing I'd like to add, and it was alluded to earlier, you know, in psychiatric illnesses, often different people respond to different drugs when they have the same illness. And in Alzheimer's disease, we don't know if this is going to be the case, but I'm anticipating that this will be the case. And so just to be open in all of the work, both the FDA, the NIA, and congressional people, that one drug will not be enough for everybody. And when we're thinking through policy and issues, to really remember that. And we're going to have a lot of people, we do have a lot of people who are going to need treatments, and every treatment will matter and have its place.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think Jeff and Joan's points are well taken. We certainly need to improve awareness of the symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, so that the patients and the caregivers are aware that there are potential treatments out there. But we do have to work with the policymakers on increasing funding in the Alzheimer's disease space. I know that's an interesting subject in Washington, but we do need to provide better funding for development of symptomatic treatments and disease-modifying treatments. And then we do need CMS and FDA to align on to ensure that once a drug is approved, that there's actually appropriate reimbursement for the patients who would very much benefit from having access to these therapies.
All very good points. Sounds like all the advocates on the phone have a lot of marching orders of how we can be doing things better, so thank you all very much. There is one more question. CMS's National Partnership to Improve Dementia Care has focused on reducing the use of antipsychotics in nursing homes for people with dementia. What would you like to say to CMS about psychotropic drug use in general and in residents with dementia? Okay. Is there anyone on the phone that can answer that?
This is Jeff. I'll plunge in, and I'm sure Rick and Joan can add as well. I think what we're seeking is appropriate antipsychotic use. And if a patient has a behavioral disturbance, they often need treatment with the existing medications, even though they are unapproved. And yes, I agree that these drugs need to be reviewed frequently, and we need to make sure that we're not using them inappropriately. But there are very good data, and in particular, I would cite Dave Devanand's work on antipsychotic withdrawal, showing the recurrence of psychosis on withdrawal of antipsychotics. We need to recognize that not only side effects are bad for the patient, but so is psychosis. I think we need to have a balanced discussion between the need for therapy and the overuse of these medications, so that we do achieve this balance of appropriate use of these important medications.
Yeah, I fully agree, Jeff. I think we shouldn't. We know that antipsychotics have some limitations in terms of tolerability, but they can be quite effective. I think I was very impressed with the list you showed, Jeff, of other agents in development for the treatment of agitation that we hope, though we don't know, will have a different and hopefully more favorable tolerability profile. But I think antipsychotics have their clearly have their use, and I think we have to remember that patients and the caregivers need these. So I think we can never forget that.
So I'd like to add to this that, as Jeff said, there's not much approved. So it's very heartening to me that there are many drugs that are in development, so that we have data, and hopefully we'll have some things which will be approved. So then people, physicians with the family's input, can then make data-driven decisions around the issues their patients are facing. And I think that this is the way that we get to appropriate use. And it's very heartening for me to see all the activity going on in the behavioral symptom space.
Thank you all so much. This has been really terrific, and we're coming up on our hour. So I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank Jeff, Rick, and Joan again for their really informative talks and the participation in the Q&A. And again, I'd like to thank the ACT-AD sponsors, Anavex, Avenir, Axovant, Biogen, Eli Lilly, Genentech, Janssen, Lundbeck, Merck, Novartis, and Otsuka for making this webinar possible. Thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a great afternoon.